In the summer of 2003, every peach grower in Chilton County, Alabama, ran their orchards the same way. They sprayed on schedule. They fertilized by the calendar. They thinned by eye in April and hoped for the best in August. This was not a strategy in any deliberate sense. It was not a system anyone had designed and chosen. It was a rhythm that had been handed down the same way a pocket knife gets handed down, without explanation, without documentation, just pressed into the palm of the next generation with the understanding that you don't need to know why it works, you just need to know that it does. The peaches grew. The buyers came in August. The cycle repeated. Nobody in Chilton County in 2003 was asking whether the rhythm could be improved because the rhythm had been producing acceptable fruit for 60 years, and acceptable fruit was what the packing houses wanted, and what the packing houses wanted was what kept the lights on. Let me tell you what acceptable looked like in those years, because you need to understand the world Vernon Spade was walking back into before you can understand what he did to change it. A typical Chilton County peach operation in the early 2000s ran somewhere between 40 and 100 acres of orchard on red clay soil that drained fast and held heat long into September. The trees were mostly Ruston Red and Harvester varieties, planted in rows spaced 20 by 20 feet, managed by a combination of dormant sprays in February, fungicide applications every 10 to 14 days from bloom through harvest, and a nitrogen program that most growers had inherited from the county extension recommendations published in 1978 and never substantially revised. The fruit was good, not exceptional. It was the kind of peach that looked right in a bin at a roadside stand, that held up through a 2-day truck ride to Atlanta or Birmingham without bruising badly, that a grocery buyer could move without complaint. It was not the kind of peach that made someone pull off the highway the second time because they remembered the first one. It was reliable peach. Chilton County peach, the kind of peach that a man could be proud of without necessarily being able to explain exactly why. Vernon Spade had grown up on 60 acres of it in the western part of the county, about 8 miles outside of Clanton, on ground his grandfather had cleared in 1947 and his father had managed from 1971 until his knees and his back made the latter work unreasonable. Vernon was 51 years old in the spring of 2003. He had spent 22 years working as a soil scientist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, first in Montgomery, then in a regional office in Muscle Shoals, traveling the state talking to farmers about erosion and compaction and the slow, quiet depletion of the land that nobody saw because it happened 1 inch at a time over 20 years. He had spent those 22 years watching what happened to ground that was treated as a production platform rather than a living system, and he had filled 3 filing cabinets worth of field notes and soil surveys with the evidence of what that cost over time. He came home in the spring of 2003 when his father could no longer manage the farm alone. He was not coming home to retire. He was not coming home to maintain what his father had built. He came home with 22 years of soil science in his head and 60 acres of clay loam under his boots, and a very clear idea about what he intended to do with both of them. What Vernon had been thinking about for the better part of a decade in between farm visits and soil surveys and the particular loneliness of state government office work was something that the sustainable agriculture research community had been quietly documenting since the mid-1980s. It was called whole orchard floor management, and the idea, stripped to its simplest form, was this: the soil under a peach tree is not a road. It is not a surface you drive equipment across and spray chemicals onto and expect to remain productive indefinitely. It is a community. It has biology in it. It has fungal networks and bacterial populations and earthworm channels and aggregate structures that took decades to build, and that a conventional spray program and a disc harrow could dismantle in a handful of seasons. The research coming out of UC Davis and Cornell and the Rodale Institute was showing that orchards managed with permanent ground cover between the rows, reduced synthetic inputs, and attention to soil biological health were producing fruit with measurably higher Brix levels, better post-harvest shelf life, and lower input costs after the transition period than comparable conventional operations. Vernon had the numbers. He had always had the numbers. He had a manila folder in the second drawer of his desk that had been getting thicker since 1996, full of trial data and journal articles, and a spreadsheet he had built himself projecting what the transition would look like on 60 acres of Chilton County red clay if the research held. He brought none of this to the Chilton County Peach Growers Association meeting in April of 2003 because he had been to enough of those meetings to know the room. He did not go to the co-op and explain himself. He did not write a letter to the county extension office. He went home, walked his father's orchards with a soil probe and a notebook, took samples from 23 locations across the 60 acres, and sent them to the Auburn University Soil Testing Laboratory with a request for biological activity analysis in addition to the standard nutrient panel. The results came back in May. They told him what he had suspected. The soil biology under the orchard was severely depleted. Earthworm counts were running at less than 2 per cubic foot in the areas with the heaviest equipment traffic. Fungal biomass was negligible. Soil organic matter averaged 1.1% across the farm, against a natural baseline for Alabama red clay of somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5%. The ground was not dying, it was producing. But it was producing the way an engine produces when you run it on minimum oil. You can get work out of it. You just cannot get everything it was built to give. He told his father what he intended to do that evening at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that his grandfather had built in 1952 and that still had the same linoleum floor and the same single bulb over the sink that Vernon had grown up under. His father, whose name was Earl Spade, and who had been farming that ground for 32 years with the patience and deliberateness of a man who had never once made a decision he was not prepared to defend, listened without interrupting. When Vernon finished, Earl Spade looked at the soil test results for a long moment. He looked at the spreadsheet Vernon had printed. He looked at the manila folder. He said, "How long before the trees noticed the difference?" Vernon said 2 years, maybe 3, before the fruit quality numbers would be meaningfully different. Possibly 4 before the input cost reduction offset the transition expenses. Earl Spade nodded once. He picked up the soil test results again. "You're the soil scientist," he said. "I grew fruit." He paused. "Those aren't the same job." He meant it as agreement, not criticism. Vernon understood it that way. Now let me tell you about the man who made certain that Vernon Spade's plans became the subject of conversation at every coffee counter and equipment barn in the western half of Chilton County, because stories like this one always have that man, and understanding him is part of understanding why the story matters. His name was Buford Kell. He was 63 years old in 2003, and he ran 90 acres of conventional peach operation 4 miles south of the Spade farm, and he had been selling fruit through the Chilton County Packing Cooperative since 1979. Buford was not a hostile man. He was not small-minded in any fundamental sense. He was a man who had survived 3 late freezes, 2 hailstorms, a brown rot epidemic in 1998 that cost him 40% of his crop, and the slow consolidation of the regional packing industry that had cut his per-bin price by 11% between 1995 and 2002, and who had come through all of it by doing the same things in the same order with the same inputs and the same equipment and the same calendar of applications that his father had handed him in 1971. His survival had been the survival of repetition. His confidence in his methods was the confidence of a man who had walked the same ground in the same boots for 32 years and was still standing. He heard about what Vernon was planning in June of 2003 through the cooperative's field representative, a man named Jack Prine, who drove the county roads, checking on member operations, and who had stopped at the Spade farm and come away with a thorough description of the ground cover. Vernon was seeding between the tree rows and the spray program. Vernon was reducing, and the soil biology program Vernon was beginning. Buford Kell heard this at the cooperative's summer membership meeting in the parking lot afterward from Jack Prine directly. "He's letting grass grow between the rows," Jack Prine said. "Says it's good for the soil biology." Buford Kell looked at the man for a moment. Then he said, "Grass between the rows pulls moisture from the trees. Any peach grower in this county could tell you that." He said it without particular venom. He said it the way a man says a thing he considers self-evident, a thing so thoroughly established by experience that the need to say it at all strikes him as mildly absurd. The comment traveled the way comments travel in a small county. By August, it had been refined and expanded and attributed to Buford Kell in a form slightly more pointed than the original, and the version that reached Vernon Spade through his father's neighbor, a woman named Ruth Ann Hadley, who kept bees on the property line, and heard most of what passed between the two farms was that Buford Kell had said Vernon Spade had gone soft from 20 years of government work and come home to kill his daddy's trees. Vernon heard this and said nothing. He went back to the orchard and checked his ground cover establishment and his soil probe readings and wrote the measurements down in his notebook. Let me pause here, because I think it is worth pausing and ask you something. Buford Kell had 32 years of experience growing peaches in that county. He was not wrong that grass competes with trees for moisture. That is a real phenomenon. It is in the textbooks. It is what every extension agent in Alabama will tell you if you ask. What Buford Kell did not know, what he could not know from behind the wheel of a spray rig running the same calendar for 3 decades, was that the research on managed orchard floor cover had resolved that competition question. Correctly managed ground cover, maintained at the right height, in the right species mix, on soil with recovering biological activity, did not reduce tree-available moisture in any measurable way on loam soils with adequate rainfall. The moisture competition effect was real on sandy or drought-prone sites. It was not real on Vernon's ground, managed the way Vernon was managing it. Buford Kell's certainty was not built on evidence from Vernon's farm. It was built on a principle extracted on context where the principle held and applied without adjustment to a context where it didn't. That is a very human thing to do. It is also the kind of thing that costs a man the ability to see what is happening in front of him. Vernon Spade knew that. Buford Kell did not yet. Let me tell you about the 3 years that followed, because the transition period is where most people would have quit, and the fact that Vernon did not is as much the story as any of the numbers that came after. The first season was not a success in any visible way. The ground cover establishment was uneven. The fescue and clover mix Vernon had seeded between the rows came in well in the lower sections, where the clay had more organic matter to begin with, and came in thin and weedy in the upper orchard where the soil was the most depleted. He mowed it 4 times between June and September, keeping it at 4 inches, and he watched the weeds compete with the desirable species through the whole first summer. The trees looked the same as they always had. The fruit that August was indistinguishable from the fruit the orchard had produced the year before. His Brix readings averaged 10.8. The county average was 10.6. The difference was not meaningful. He told his father the transition was proceeding as expected. Earl Spade asked what that meant. Vernon said it meant the soil was not yet responding because the biology had not yet recovered enough to express itself through the tree. He said, "This would take another season, maybe 2. Earl looked at the thinning in the upper orchard and said nothing. The second season was better in the upper orchard. The ground cover had thickened over the winter, where Vernon had overseeded with crimson clover in October, and by May the upper rows had a stand he could be satisfied with. He had reduced his synthetic nitrogen applications by 40% from the baseline his father had been running, and replaced them with a combination of composted municipal biosolids applied in March and a fish emulsion foliar spray in June. His fungicide program was down to 6 applications for the season, from the 14 his father had been running, and he was timing those applications to disease pressure models he was running on a laptop in the kitchen rather than to the calendar. The fruit in August of the second year was different. Not dramatically, not in a way that a roadside buyer would have noticed or been able to name, but Vernon noticed it. His Brix readings averaged 11.4 across the farm, with the best blocks in the lower orchard running 12.1. He took 6 peaches from different blocks and sent them to a private laboratory in Tennessee that ran sensory analysis panels. The results came back in September. Volatile aromatic compound levels were running 31% above his baseline measurements from the first season. Titratable acidity was up 16%. The laboratory's panel described the fruit from his 2 best blocks as having, quote, pronounced floral and honey notes with a clean finish uncommon in commercial stone fruit. He showed his father the laboratory results. Earl Spade read them twice. Brix of 12.1, his father said. In the lower blocks, Vernon said. The upper orchard was 11.1. Earl Spade set the paper down. He looked out the kitchen window at the orchard. "The upper orchard's always been the problem ground," he said. "It's recovering," Vernon said. "The biology is moving up from the lower rows, another season." His father nodded. He did not say anything else that evening, but Vernon noticed that the following morning, before Vernon was up, Earl had walked the lower orchard with the soil probe that Vernon kept by the back door. He found the probe leaning against the porch rail when he came down for coffee, with a piece of tape on the handle marking the depth his father had reached before hitting resistance. 14 inches. Vernon's measurements from the same block in 2003 had been 7. The third season was when the argument in Chilton County got its answer. The summer of 2006 was hot in a way that Chilton County had not seen since 1986. Rainfall from June through August ran 35% below the 30-year average. The county extension office issued drought advisory notices in July for the first time in 19 years. The peach trees across the county went under stress in ways that ranged from moderate to severe, depending on the depth of the root systems and the water-holding capacity of the soil under them. The peach is not a drought-tolerant fruit crop. It is a crop that requires consistent moisture from fruit set through harvest, and when that moisture is absent, the fruit that results is small and mealy and low in sugar, and the kind of thing that a packing house buyer will price down without apology. Buford Kell lost 38% of his projected yield to the drought. The fruit that did come in averaged Brix of 9.1, below the cooperative's quality threshold, and a portion of it was rejected at the packing line. He sold what he could and lost what he couldn't, and ended the season approximately $31,000 below his projected revenue. Across the county, the story was similar. The cooperative's aggregate quality data for the 2006 season was the worst since 1903. Average Brix across member operations ran 9.8. Average pack-out rates were down 22% from the 5-year mean. The forced discounting and the rejected fruit together represented what the cooperative's manager called at the fall prayer meeting, in the careful language of a man who did not want to frighten anyone, a challenging season. Vernon Spade's orchard did not have a challenging season. Let me be precise about this, because precision is the point. His ground cover by the summer of 2006 was fully established across all 60 acres. The fescue and clover mix in the upper orchard, the last section to recover, had closed in completely the previous fall after Vernon's third overseeding. His soil organic matter readings from the spring 2006 sampling had averaged 2.4% across the farm, up from 1.1% in 2003. Earthworm counts in the lower orchard were running 11 per cubic foot. The root systems of his trees, which he had been documenting by digging soil profile pits at the end of each season, had deepened measurably every year since the transition, and by 2006 the active root zone in his best blocks was running 20 to 22 inches compared to 9 to 11 inches on comparable conventional operations he had served for reference. Those roots were reaching moisture that the shallow-rooted conventional orchards could not access. His ground cover, which Buford Kell had said would pull moisture from the trees, was in a drought year doing the opposite of what Buford Kell had predicted. The clover was fixing nitrogen into the soil. The fescue was maintaining a microclimate under the canopy that reduced evaporative loss from the soil's surface. The biological activity in the soil was maintaining an aggregate structure that held water at depth rather than letting it run off the clay surface the way it ran off ground that had been disked and sprayed and compacted over decades. Vernon reduced his irrigation by 20% below his planned schedule in July, and his trees did not show stress. His fruit that August averaged bricks of 12.3 across the farm. His best block ran 13.1. His pack-out rate was 94%. He sold every bin at the cooperative's premium tier, the top price bracket reserved for fruit that met the bricks and pack-out standards that most members rarely hit in a good year. In a drought year, Vernon Spade hit them on 60 acres. The revenue comparison was not subtle. His 2006 gross was 18% above his 2005 revenue. In the worst drought year in 2 decades, on the same ground that had been considered the less productive half of the county's peach land when his father was running it, Vernon Spade had his best season since taking over the farm. He did not attend the fall cooperative meeting where the drought year numbers were discussed. He sent his data to the county extension office instead, the same way Nora had sent hers in another county, in another state, in another decade, not because the gesture was calculated, but because it was the correct thing to do with information that belonged to more than one farm. The extension agent, a methodical woman named Carol Dressen, who had been watching the Spade operation since 2004 with the focused interest of someone who could read a soil test and understand what it meant, published a summary of the transition and the 2006 results in the state extension newsletter in January of 2007. The summary ran 4 pages. It included the soil organic matter trajectory, the root depth data, the bricks comparisons, and the drought year revenue figures. It included a description of the ground cover program and the reduced input protocol. And it noted, in the careful language of extension writing, that the results from the Spade operation in Chilton County appeared to be consistent with what the research literature had predicted and warranted further study. Buford Kell read the newsletter in February of 2007. He read it at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and he read it twice. Then he drove to the Spade farm. He came in the morning, around 8:30, and parked his truck at the gate and walked in because the gate was closed. Vernon was in the lower orchard checking the ground cover for winter die-off, which had been minimal, and he looked up and saw Buford Kell walking between the tree rows, looking at the ground cover the way a man looks at something he has been wrong about. Buford Kell stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at the fescue stand. He looked at the clover that had survived the winter and was already showing green at the base. He looked at the tree trunks, which were clean and healthy and without the scale pressure that had been showing up in his own orchard since 2004. "I read Dressen's piece," he said. Vernon waited. "Bricks of 12.3 in a drought year," Buford said. He said it the way a man reads an indictment. 12.3 average, Vernon said. Best block was 13.1. Buford Kell looked at the ground cover again. He had the look of a man who had walked into a room expecting to find it one way and found it another and was taking the time to recalibrate. "I told you that grass would pull moisture from the trees," he said. He said it quietly, without the certainty that had been in his voice in the parking lot in 2003. He said it like a man checking whether a door was locked that he had always assumed was locked and finding the knob turning in his hand. "You did," Vernon said. "Doesn't look like that's what happened." "No," Vernon said. "It isn't." Buford was quiet. A mockingbird went through its catalog somewhere in the upper orchard. A cold February wind moved the top of the clover. "I've got 2 growers asking me about this system," Buford said. "After Dressen's piece, they want to know how to start the transition." He paused. "I don't know how to tell them." Vernon looked at him for a moment. "The thing worth understanding," he said, "is that the ground cover isn't the point. The ground cover is the signal that the soil is being managed differently. What you're actually doing is rebuilding the biology. You're giving the soil back the thing that 30 years of disking and synthetic nitrogen and broad-spectrum fungicide applications took out of it. The biology is what holds the water. The biology is what feeds the tree between your fertilizer applications. The biology is what the tree evolved to work with before we decided we could replace it with a spray schedule." He paused. "The drought didn't expose a weakness in your system. The drought just made visible what the system had always been missing." Buford Kell looked at him. He nodded. Once the nod of a man receiving something he cannot dispute. "Could you sit down with those 2 growers?" he said. "Yes," Vernon said. "I can do that. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the conversation in the orchard that February morning was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different kind of story. By the spring of 2008, Vernon was running the full 60 acres under the biological management program, with soil organic matter still climbing and root depth still increasing, and a fruit quality profile that Carol Dressen had begun using as the reference data point in her extension presentations around the state. The 2 growers Buford had mentioned installed ground cover programs that spring, one on 40 acres and one on 25, both using the species, mix, and mowing protocol Vernon had documented. Both reported measurable bricks improvements in their second season. By 2010, 11 Chilton County operations had made some version of the transition. By 2013, the number was 22, representing roughly a third of the cooperative's total acreage, and the cooperative's aggregate quality data for that year showed an average bricks of 11.4 across member operations, up from the 2003 baseline of 10.6. Not a number that made headlines, a number that meant something to everyone who understood what it cost to move fruit up 1 bricks point on 60 acres of red clay. Carol Dressen presented the county-wide data at the Alabama Fruit Growers Symposium in Montgomery in 2012. She gave Vernon Spade's name as the source of the original transition work. He was in the audience. He was 60 years old. He was wearing a Carhartt jacket with a soil probe in the left-hand pocket, and he had red clay on his work boots from a morning profile pit he had dug before driving to Montgomery. When Carol Dressen said his name, The growers in his row turned to look at him, and someone near the front began to applaud, and the room came up with it. Earl Spade was not in the room. He had passed in the winter of 2009, quietly in the same farmhouse he had farmed from for 32 years, with his green ledger books stacked on the mudroom shelf and his soil probe hanging on the peg beside the door. But Vernon's daughter, who was 24 and had just finished her graduate work in agroecology at Auburn, and who had been walking the Spade orchard since she could reach the lowest branch, was sitting 2 seats to Vernon's left. When the room started clapping, she did not look at her father. She looked at the data on Carol Dresson's slide, at the bricks numbers climbing in a line from 2003 to 2012, and she put her hands together, and she did not stop. There is one more thing, because the story has a turn in it that happened not at a symposium or a cooperative meeting or a kitchen table, but in the lower orchard on a March morning in 2015. Vernon was 63. He had been slowing the daily physical work down incrementally for 2 years, the way a man slows down when his body makes the negotiation terms clear. His daughter, whose name was June Spade, and who had come back to the farm the previous fall, was doing the early season pruning work and the cover crop management and the soil sampling that Vernon had always done alone. She had her own notebook, a black hardcover field notebook that she kept in the back pocket of her work pants, and her handwriting was smaller and more precise than her father's, and her soil probe readings were documented to a finer level of detail than his because she had been trained to document them that way. One morning in March, she came in from the lower orchard with a soil probe reading and a question. She had been reading about biochar incorporation as a method to further increase soil carbon density and water retention in the lower blocks, which were already performing well, but where she thought there was still headroom. She had a stack of papers from the Journal of Environmental Quality and a preliminary trial design she had sketched in the back pages of her notebook. She put them on the kitchen table and pushed them toward her father. Vernon Spade looked at the papers. He looked at the trial design. He looked at his daughter. He thought about a kitchen table conversation in the spring of 2003 and a Manila folder, and a father who had said, "You're the soil scientist, and I grew fruit," and had meant it as agreement. He thought about the lower orchard in August of 2006 with bricks of 13.1, and the soil probe going 22 inches, and the way that had felt like a confirmation of something he had spent 22 years at the USDA believing, but had never had 60 acres to prove. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked up at his daughter. "Let's run the trial," he said. He did not ask for a week to think about it. Buford Kell retired in 2016. At the cooperative's annual meeting that November, he was given the Grower Service Award for 45 years of membership. He stood at the front of the room and gave a short speech in which he said the thing he had learned in 4 decades of growing peaches was that the land will tell you what it needs if you are willing to listen, and that the hardest part of farming is learning to distinguish between what you know and what you have simply always done. He did not name Vernon Spade. He did not need to. 11 of the 26 people in the room were running biological orchard programs on his recommendation. The lower orchard at the Spade Farm is still running the ground cover program that Vernon established in 2003. The soil organic matter in the oldest blocks is now above 3.8%. The root depth readings in the best sections are running 26 inches. June Spade walks the orchard every morning with a soil probe and a black notebook. The biochar trial she started in 2015 has produced results she is preparing to submit for peer review. She keeps the field notebooks in the mudroom of the farmhouse, on the same shelf where her grandfather kept his green ledger books. Vernon's folders are there too, the original manila folder from the second drawer of his desk, the one that had been getting thicker since 1996, sitting beside her black notebooks with its edges worn soft from handling, his handwriting on the folder label, her handwriting in the notebooks. The same shelf, the same red clay on the boots by the door, the peaches in the lower orchard run bricks of 13.4 in a good year. That is not an accident. That is 20 years of listening to ground that finally had someone willing to hear it.